In this tutorial, we'll see how to create a checkout form. The form's got several fields that have a red border around them showing that the fields are yet to be filled in with valid data. As we complete the fields, the red border disappears. The form uses various types of input components, such as text input, radio buttons, drop-down menus. Let's create a checkout form. First, let's rename the page to Checkout Form and set the background color. Next, we'll add a box that will hold the form. We'll rename the box to Form Holder, and we'll set up its layout on the page. Now, let's add a box that will hold the address. We'll press and hold the Command key while dragging the box, to drop it right into the form holder. Next, we'll rename the box to Address Holder, and we'll adjust its position and style. OK, now let's add a number and a label to this form section. As before, we'll use Command Drag to drop a text component into the Address Holder box. Next, we'll rename the text component to Section Label and adjust its position and style. Now, let's add a section number. We'll add a box, change its background color, and we'll change its radius to 50% to give it a round shape. Next, we'll put a text component inside the box and adjust its position and style. OK, now let's add a component that will hold the address fields. To do this, we'll add to the address holder a box and we'll rename the box to Name and Address. Next, we'll adjust the position and style of the Name and Address box. Now, we'll drop a text component into the Name and Address box, and we'll set its layout to Parent Directed. Next, we'll change the parent's direction to column. Now, we'll adjust the text component's dimensions and the font style. Now, let's put a text input component inside the same box. We'll also set the text input component's layout to Parent Directed and adjust the dimensions a bit. OK, now we'll bind the repeater of the Name and Address box to the spreadsheet. We're using the auto and down direction to use all cells going downward in the spreadsheet until we see a blank cell. Now, let's use the tiles arrangement and set the horizontal gap to 10 pixels to add a bit of space between the fields. Next, we'll bind the text component and the placeholder property of the text input component to data in the spreadsheet. We'll also bind the text input component's value to the spreadsheet to collect the user input. OK, here's the fun part. Let's change the border color of the fields based on whether the field is empty or not. To do this, we'll select the text input component and enable validation. Next, we'll select the Is Non-Empty checkbox, and we'll bind the Is Valid property to the spreadsheet. Because the fields are currently empty, the Is Valid property's value is false. We'll change the color based on this value, using the If formula here. If the value is true, the color will be red. If the value is false, the color will be gray. Next, we'll bind the text input component's border color to this cell. Now, let's click the Preview button and check out what we've built so far. As we complete the fields, their border color changes from red to gray. Perfect. OK, now let's create a state field with a drop-down menu. We'll add a box and rename it to Drop-Down Holder. Then we'll adjust its position and style. Next, we'll add a text component to hold the field label and we'll add a drop-down component. We'll then define their position and style. Now, let's bind the drop-down component to the spreadsheet. In the spreadsheet, we'll use the grab function to grab the value of the currently selected item. Then we'll use the isNull function to check whether the cell is empty. The cell with the color value has an if formula that checks the value of the cell containing the isNull function and changes the color based on whether the value is true or false. Let's bind the border color to this cell. We'll also bind the text component's value to the spreadsheet. Now, let's add a zip field. Similarly to what we've already seen, we'll add a box to the address holder. And we'll adjust its position and style. Next, we'll add a text component and a text input component to the box. We'll adjust the component's position and style, and we'll bind the component's properties to the spreadsheet. Now, to check that the entered text is a valid zip code, we'll first enable Format and select Regular Expression. And then, we'll bind the Format property to the cell that contains an appropriate regex pattern. Next, we'll enable validation and make sure that the matches format and is non-empty checkboxes are selected so that in addition to checking whether the field is empty, we'll also check that the input text matches the regular expression. The same way as before, we'll bind the isValid property to the cell under isValid. And we'll bind the border color to the cell here. The cell contains the if formula we've already seen. Let's check out how our validation works. When we select an item in the drop-down menu and enter a valid zip code in the zip field, the red border disappears. Awesome! Now, let's add a checkbox to our form. We'll add a checkbox component, and we'll bind its label property to this cell here. Then we'll adjust its position and style. Okay, now, let's create a payment section. Let's try reusing the components we've already defined. We'll use Alt-Drag to create a copy of the address holder, and then we'll adjust the position and style of the address holder copy. Next, we'll remove the drop-down holder as we won't need it in this section. We'll also change the names of all the components we've copied. Now, let's change the number and title of the section. Now, before rebinding the components we're reusing, first we'll remove all their existing bindings. Next, we'll bind the component's properties to the spreadsheet similarly to what we've seen before. And we'll speed it up a bit. Next, we'll adjust the position of the card name and number box and the position of the card expiration and CVV box. Okay, now let's add a radio button group to the payment holder. We'll then adjust its position and style and bind the item's property to data in the spreadsheet. Let's check out what we've built. Works fine. Great. The card data in the published application lives purely in the browser and, when connected to a PCI-compliant system, can power an entire shopping experience. Okay, finally, let's add a cart section to our form. As before, we'll reuse the components we've already set up. With the help of Alt-Drag, we'll make a copy of the address holder, and then we'll rename it to cart holder. Next, we'll adjust its position and style. Now, we'll remove all the components from the cart holder except for the section title. Next, we'll rename the section to Your Cart. Now, let's add a cart icon to the section title. To do this, we'll add to the cart holder an icon component, we'll set its style properties, and we'll position it right next to the section title. Next, we'll add a box to hold the items in the cart. And then we'll add two text components for the item names and prices. And we'll define their layout and font properties. Next, we'll bind the repeater of the items holder to data in the spreadsheet, and then we'll bind the text components values to the spreadsheet to display our list of items with the total order price. In this case, we're using the spreadsheet and some sample data, but in a real shopping cart, we'd use formulas to grab data from a web API or a built-in Mint database. Now, let's add a button to submit the form. We'll add a button component and set its caption to continue to checkout. Next, we'll define its position in the cart holder, and we'll tweak its style. We'll set the button's normal background color as well as the background color on hover. And that's all there is to it. We've completed our checkout form that not only looks good but also works well. It's also very secure because the data we enter lives solely in the browser. In this tutorial, we've seen how to use command drag to drop components right into any container, like a box. How to use the repeater to repeat items and arrange them on the page. How to reuse existing components. And last but not least, we've seen how to add validation to our checkout form to ensure that the fields are not empty, and the entered values correspond to the predefined format.